Hey guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I'm going to do my October wrap-up. So as I explained in my last video that I did, which is called Where the Heck Have I Been?, October was a very busy month for me. I launched my podcast, I took a bit of a step back from doing videos and reviews and all this kind of thing, just for a little bit of me time, which of course means that I didn't read as much as I wanted to this month because the last couple of weeks of the month were a little bit tough for reading because I've been in a little bit of a reading slump, but I still managed to read 8 books this month. I had a really interesting mix of things. I read more contemporary YA than I usually ever read. It's not a genre that I particularly like, but for whatever reason I really connected with it. I read a horror book, I read a historical fiction book, I read just a bunch of different things, and that was actually really nice because I tend to read so much sci-fi and fantasy that I can kind of get myself into a little bit of a rut. So doing something that was a little bit different this month was very nice. The very first book that I read this month, I think might be one of my favorite books of the year. So this is The Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy, and this is by Mackenzie Lee. So in The Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy, which is the longest title ever, Felicity continues on with her sort of attempts to be accepted into medical school. And of course, at this particular point in time, women were not allowed to practice medicine. You could kind of be like a midwife, and that was about it. But she's determined to become a doctor. She finds out one day that her sort of, I guess you could call him her idol, a doctor who she really likes and she loves his research and the books that he puts out and everything, is looking for research assistants. The only problem is that she is in London and he is in Germany. So she has to sort of take on the help of this mysterious woman who is going to travel in disguise as her lady's maid, and she has to go and sort of find this man before he gets married to her former childhood best friend. There's a lot of coincidence that happens in this book, but it all works really well. I loved the writing style. I loved the characters. I feel like this is the kind of book I really wish I had when I was a teenager. Not only does it have great representation, it has a Muslim character, it has an asexual character, it has these wonderful female friendships, all of that is great. But this book also has the single best takedown of the not like other girls trope. I'm gonna do a full review of this book at some point, so I will kind of save my long ranting about how much I enjoyed it and its particular takedowns of tropes and the particular tropes that it included that I really enjoyed for that video. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. I really loved it. If you liked the first book, then I would so highly recommend this one because I think it's even better. So the next book that I have, I also received from the publisher alongside The Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy. This is Shil Girls by Claire Legrand. This is from Harper 360. So I kind of took a little bit of a chance on this book because I haven't read any of her other books, which are fantasy, and this is horror. Basically, this book is about a girl named Marion and her family, her mum and her sister Charlotte, who move to this island off the east coast of the US called Shil Rock. And Shil Rock is kind of sort of an isolated place, and it's one of those places where the divide between the very wealthy and the very poor is pretty staggering. So immediately Charlotte becomes sort of entrenched in this life with this girl named Val, who's the daughter of one of the very mega wealthy families on this island, and her family, of course, Miriam and Charlotte's family, is quite poor. They are, in fact, they're housekeepers. And we have another girl named Zoe who's kind of the social outcast. She is the daughter of the town sheriff. Of course, this all sounds well and good. However, Shil Rock has a little bit of a secret because young women have been going missing for decades, and it's not stopped by the time that Marion and her family come to the island. So it's this really great mix of sort of contemporary YA fiction and horror. There's some very creepy elements to this book. I would say it's very much light horror. It's not going to be something that scares you too badly, although it does have some very creepy moments, and it does have some, I think, excellent homages to sort of horror films, which I really loved. I am also going to do a full review of this book. I'll probably do one with The Lady's Guide, but I feel like the characters were amazing, and it's definitely a fantastic sort of feminist horror novel. However, I feel like in a way she was kind of like ticking the boxes of things that need to be included in horror books. And there were some aspects which are very spoilery, which I won't talk about until, later on in maybe a spoiler review, that I felt just weren't necessary and really sort of pulled me straight out of this book. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I really liked it. I wanted to love it much more than I did, but it's definitely a very good spooky kind of autumnal read. Next up, we have a book that I really, really wish I did the audiobook for, because apparently the audiobook is amazing. So if you're interested in this book and you like audiobooks, I think that that might be the way to go, because I feel like I would have gotten a lot more out of it. This is Sadie by Courtney Summers. So this is a book that a lot of people are talking about. It is a YA contemporary novel again, but it is very, very, very dark, and has some content warnings that I'll go into in a second. So just as a heads up, it is not a happy book. So Sadie follows a sort of dual narrative. The first is this girl named Sadie, as I'm sure you can imagine, and she has just lost her little sister Maddie. Maddie has been murdered, and Maddie's murderer has not been found. However, Sadie knows who it is, and she decides she's going to go after this man. So she has no family, she has no friends, and she just kind of goes. So that's the one sort of storyline. The other, which is the storyline that I was really, really interested in, and I think what's going to work really well for an audiobook, is a true crime podcast based on Maddie's story. So basically a radio personality has heard about Maddie's story, and he goes to Sadie's town and begins to interview sort of the woman who acted like a motherly figure toward them, and begins to sort of trace Sadie's steps. And I thought that it was like so good. It was so fantastic. If you've listened to the podcast S-Town, which is sort of a spin-off of Serial, it very much has that vibe, and of course S-Town is fantastic. So this was really good. It's not happy. It is an absolute page turner and you'll fly through it, but just a couple of content warnings for pedophilia and sexual abuse. Nothing on screen, but very, very heavily implied, and it's a huge theme throughout the book. And I liked this book a lot, and I feel weird saying that I liked it, but it's fantastic. It's really well done. I just feel like I didn't necessarily connect with Sadie's story as much as I could have. I loved the podcast side. It's basically like a transcript of the episode. So I think that, again, audiobook would have really been the way to go for this. Maybe, I don't know, next year when it's out of my head a little bit, I will go ahead and get the audiobook and listen to it then. I think it's quite short. It's under 10 hours. But I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I really liked it. I wish that I sort of had that connection to the characters, which I felt in other books that I've read this month, but a little bit less in this one. The next book that I read is another one that is very, very different for me. Another YA contemporary. I need to stop saying that I don't read YA contemporary, because clearly, just judging from this month's books, it's just not true. So this is A Very Large Expanse of Sea, and this is by Tahada Mafi. So you may know the name if you're into YA. She wrote the Shatter Me series, which I know literally nothing about. I've never read it, I've never picked them up, which are, I think, fantasy or sci-fi. This is very much an autobiographical book about her experiences as a Muslim teenager in America just after 9/11. And I am usually not necessarily into sort of semi-autobiographical books. I'm not into memoirs, and I'm not really into contemporary YA, but this really caught my eye, and I was very interested to see what it was like. And it's fantastic. It's an excellent, excellent book. It's incredibly well done, and I really loved it. So this book takes place the year after 9/11, and we follow a girl named Shireen, and she and her family move constantly. Her parents are immigrants from Iran, and they are constantly trying to, get better jobs and make more money and provide a better life for their kids. So it's her and her brother. They are constantly moving to new schools. Her brother is kind of like a social animal. Everyone loves him. He's very handsome. He's very attractive. But she is someone who people tend to avoid in these very white towns because she does wear her hijab, and she's just sort of, she says that she's kind of an exotic creature to these people. So she in this book has just moved to a new town, and this is sort of a turning point in her life. This book was really fantastic. It's short. I think it's just under 300 pages, but it really packs a punch. It packs a very emotional punch. Also, it's set in the early 2000s, which is when I was about her age, and so you get things like AIM conversations, which is sort of like super nostalgic, and I really liked. I really liked this book. If contemporary YA is not really your thing, or sort of, you know, these kinds of memoir-esque books are not really your thing, I would still highly recommend picking this up because it's just incredibly well done and it's really engaging, and it's an excellent, excellent book. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. So now we have the books that I don't have physical copies of. So I read 2 of these as ebooks. I'm looking at my list right now. 2 of these were ebooks. One of these was an audiobook and one was actually a book that I borrowed. So the one that I borrowed was the second Lockwood book. This is The Whispering Skull by Jonathan Stroud. So the sort of premise of these books is that about 40 years ago, the problem, capitalized, came about. Essentially, ghosts and spirits and ghouls and all these horrible things began to rise in Britain and sort of changed the entire country overnight. So of course we follow Lockwood and his sort of agency. Our main character is Lucy, and it's told in the first person, and Lucy has just joined up with the gang in the first book, and now this is the second one. This is their kind of second big case. I really liked this book. I feel like I love the first one so much, and I liked the second one a lot, but I feel like the story was much stronger in the first one. In this one, they basically have to hunt down this artifact that has been stolen from the coffin of this horrible, horrible man. And I won't spoil anything because half the fun is sort of the revelation of what's happening, but I feel like it was a little bit less compelling than the first one. It was a little bit slow in the middle. I gave The Whispering Skull 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a little bit less than the first one though. The next 2 books that I read were actually for the podcast that I run with my sister. You're never going to read this. I'll leave links below, but basically we recommend books to each other because we have very, very different taste in books, but we think that a lot of the things we love, the other sister will love as well. So the first one was The Lake House by Kate Morton. This was Julia's recommendation for our second episode. This is historical women's fiction. Kate Morton is one of those authors who writes giant books, and she's written a bunch of them. They sell like hotcakes. They're amazing. You can find them in charity shops if you're interested. I see them all the time, and they are so beautifully written. I really liked this one. So The Lake House is a it's not even like a split time narrative. It's got so many different perspectives and point of views and timelines that weave together so incredibly well. But the main ones are this woman named Sadie, no relation to the book, Sadie, who is a police officer, and she is sort of forced onto leave. She's forced to take holiday because she's screwed up in a case. So she goes down to Cornwall, beautiful part of the country, to stay with her grandfather for a while, and she's kind of like sorting herself out. She is really sort of obviously tortured by this particular case, and we learn more about the case as the book goes on. So she's out running one day, running, and she sort of breaks through the trees, and she stumbles upon this completely run down, abandoned, but what must have once been incredibly beautiful and grand house, and it's called the Lake House. And she is very interested in this house, and she's kind of looks through the windows, and it's clearly just been abandoned. There's things still on, you know, tables, there's an open book on the sofa, but it's clearly been abandoned for a very long time. She becomes very interested in the house and begins to search into the back history and discovers that there was this horrible tragedy that happened. The Edvin family who lived there, their young son went missing one night in 1930 something and the case was never solved. He was never found. So the other perspective, the other main perspective I should say, is Alice Edvin herself, and we get her as a sort of 16-year-old girl the summer that her brother goes missing, and we get her as an older woman in our modern time. She's become a very successful crime writer. And the way that this book is sort of, as I said, woven together with all of these timelines, and all of these characters. You get so many twists and turns and different perspectives, and it will completely, you'll think one thing about a person and then you'll get their point of view and you'll think something completely different. And the way that it's done is masterful. I really, really loved that. The writing is beautiful. It's incredibly atmospheric. She has this gorgeous, gorgeous way of writing, particularly the historical parts. The only thing that I didn't really like about this book, which my sister actually agrees with me on, is Sadie's own story. So we obviously need her in the modern time to discover this house and uncover the mystery and sort of keep the interest in the mystery alive, because Alice Edvin is not interested anymore. She wants to kind of forget that this has ever happened. And her kind of story, her backstory and everything is a little bit thin. She's clearly just a vehicle for the plot, but she's a very major vehicle for the plot. And I didn't enjoy her nearly as much as the historical parts. The historical parts are absolutely incredible, some of the best historical fiction writing I've read, but the modern stuff, particularly Sadie's, you take it or leave it. Next book that I read for the podcast, again, I don't have here, is a book by one of Julia's author friends who we did feature on the podcast. We interviewed her, which was really, really fun. I read her new release that has just come out. It's called The Royal Runaway. This is by Lindsay Emery. So The Royal Runaway is so much fun, and if you are someone who likes fantasy but wants to try some contemporary romance, this is a great, great option, because Lindsay actually says in that episode that it's almost like fantasy anyway, because it's essentially about a princess named Thea. She has been, imagine like, you know, the incredible royal wedding, like Meghan Markle's wedding. She gets jilted at the altar by her fiance, who is I think he's a Scottish duke, and she is pretty pissed off, as one would be, and she spends some time recovering from the sort of more embarrassment than a heartbreak, and she ends up sneaking out of the palace one day. She ends up meeting a man named Nick, and Nick sort of like ends up being involved in this great mystery. She's going to find out what's happened to her fiance. She's going to find out more about this man. She's going to kind of break away from the expectations of her because of her family. She's going to become queen one day. Thea is a character who has an amazing story arc, but doesn't start out as a weak character. She's not a weak character who turns into a strong character. She's a strong character who turns into a stronger character. And I really liked that because you're rooting for her the whole time. I was less of a fan of Nick just because I feel like every romance reader has their sort of preferred hero and heroine type. Thea was definitely my preferred heroine type, but Nick was a little bit too sort of alpha for me. So I did not like him at first, but I did warm to him toward the end. That was kind of the only aspect of the book that I was a little bit less keen on. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I really, really enjoyed it. It has a great US and UK cover, and I am so glad that I ended up reading this. I tend to shy away from contemporary romance, but it is kind of almost like a fantasy on its own, and it worked really, really well for me. The last book that I read this month was my audiobook, and this was Lethal White by Robert Galbraith, which of course is J.K. Rowling. This is the 4th and most recent book in the Cormoran Strike series. I really like these books, particularly once they sort of hit their stride a little bit better with books 2 and 3, and I liked this one, but I think it's not as strong as the others, which I'll talk about in a second. So I don't want to talk about the plot too much because it might sort of spoil the rest of the series, but basically in every book it's a different, very different type of crime novel. So the very first one is the kind of high-profile celebrity who dies. And kind of dealing with the paparazzi and the limelight and, you know, pop culture and all of this. The second one is all about the publishing industry, which I loved. I think that's my favorite one. And dealing with kind of crazy writers, crazy publishers, and sort of publishing as a wild world of its own. The third one is the serial killer book, which is also very, very good. That's a close second favorite. And this one is all about politics. And I really enjoyed a lot of aspects of this book, but it is 600 pages. And it needed to be cut down. It needed some significant editing, however, I feel like it's J.K. Rowling, and they wanted to get it out as quick as possible. I think she finished it, and it was published maybe a couple months later, which is like astonishing. So I think that it could have used some really good editing because there's a lot that could have been trimmed out of this book and made a lot tighter. It was a little bit tough to get through, not tough to get through, but slow to get through in some parts. And I did enjoy it, but it's definitely sort of my third favorite, the first one being my least favorite. I am kind of intrigued to see where this story is going to go. I don't want to spoil this for anyone, but I'm very interested in sort of the professional relationship between Cormoran Strike, who's our private detective, and Robin, who is his sort of, she starts out as his secretary, basically. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts that I don't want to talk about because I don't want to spoil it for anyone else. So if you want to talk about Lethal White, message me somewhere. We will talk about it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars because I liked it. I liked it a lot less than the others, but it's still sort of quality, to me, quality crime fiction. So that is it. Those are all the books that I read in the month of October. I am slightly disappointed in the number of books that I read. However, I realize that 8 is a really good number. I shouldn't be complaining, but in the last 2 weeks of the month, when I normally read about 4, I read Lockwood and I read A Very Large Expanse of Sea, and that was it. And I just feel like I am in this reading slump. I'm kind of embracing it. I'm trying to not force myself out of it, but I wish that I read more, and I wish I could read more. But it's going to be, I think, another slow month next month because of NaNoWriMo, and I'm going to try to rein in my reading a little bit to hopefully keep myself from burning out again. So let me know in the comments below if you read any great books this month, if you've read any of these books, if you're interested in these books. I would love to hear from you. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so definitely hit subscribe, check back next time, and I will see you soon.